Hello and welcome to today's One Voice webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. This is a Washington, D.C. update covering federal government policy developments. We'll be talking about COVID updates as well as other legislative and regulatory issues. I'm Caitlin Sickles. I'm a principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. Also on today's webinar, you'll hear from Paul Nathanson, a senior principal here at PRG. You'll also hear from Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. Sorry, John, mispronounced your name for a second, who are your on-the-ground lobbyists doing advocacy work here in Washington, D.C. at the Franklin Partnership. So if you are new to these webinars and haven't heard them before, we've been putting them on for quite a while. About first every week and now every other week since the beginning of the pandemic. As I said, they cover a wide range of issues, and you can hear previously recorded webinars online. You can find them at onevoiceinfo.org. That's onevoiceinfo.org. We will put that URL up at the end of today's webinar. You'll be able to find recordings there as well as all of the slides. So, and links to other materials that are mentioned in the webinar. So as you can see on the screen, we have a lot on the agenda today. We'll start with federal COVID regulatory activity. We'll also talk about other activity from federal agencies. We'll give you an update on the maybe skiddy, maybe happening compete spills or chip spills, and then we'll also talk about tariffs. I know many folks are following the ongoing ITC hearings. So let's start from the top. John, I will turn it over to you to start there.
Well, thanks, Caitlin, and thanks everybody for joining us. And again, as always, if you've done this before, there's a little box in the lower right-hand side. If you have a question, feel free to ask the question during the course of this webinar, and we'll try to answer those in due course. We won't necessarily wait till the end, but we will have time for questions at the end. Moving forward, the Equal Opportunity Employment, EEOC, issued a number of guidances or FAQs, frequently asked questions, regarding how employers should deal with COVID. And the first one was whether an employer can require a note from a medical professional, a doctor, before an employee can return back to work. And essentially, the EEOC says yes, an employer can require a doctor's note, but alternatively, they can look to the CDC recommendations as additional guidance moving forward. So yes, you can require a doctor's note, but I think they have, reading between the lines, says, yes, that's an extreme situation. Just look at what the CDC says, what their guidance is for when an employee should return back to work. So that was the first one moving forward. The other one is, does the ADA require, and can an employer require an employee to provide an antibody test before returning to work? Here, the EEOC says, no, you can't do it. An antibody test is a medical procedure, and it doesn't necessarily prove whether you are infected with COVID. So they did recommend referring back to CDC guidelines on that particular issue. And then if an employer is hiring somebody, can they require the potential candidate to to show a negative COVID test, before hiring, before the interview? And here the EEOC says yes, if you're doing this for all people entering your shop, whether it's your employees, whether it's visitors, whether it's contractors, as long as you're testing everybody, as long as you have the same requirement, if you have an applicant who's coming in, you can require that they do show a negative test. So I think that's an additional guidance for many of our members. So, Omar?
Yeah, thanks, John. A couple of others here. And the key point is, the reason we're putting this out there, and so many of them, there's a lot more FAQs in this COVID guidance that was put out, and it's a guidance. What we would suggest is that have somebody in HR consider what they're doing right now and see how it matches up with the latest update that came out from a couple of weeks ago. That's the real message here. Not a lot of this is going to be groundbreaking, but some of these here might be a relaxation of current policies that you might be having, or might be providing additional layers. And that's the reason that we're suggesting you take a look at that. For example, looking at employee screening. If you're hiring applicants, can you screen them for symptoms for COVID-19? And the answer there is yes. An employer may screen job applicants for symptoms of COVID-19 after making a conditional job offer, as long as it does so for all entering employees. And that goes to John's previous point there with regards to don't discriminate, treat everybody equally. If you're going to do this for them, do this for that. That's where it goes. And if employer screens everyone, to John's point, contractors, visitors, etc., then the applicant pre-offer stage who needs to be in the workplace as part of that may likewise be screened for COVID-19. Again, some things that you likely are already doing, or again, what they're trying to do here is make sure that you're doing the same thing across the board. Additional guidance from the EEOC that came out, here's on C4 and C5, as you'll take a look, deals with withdrawing a job offer when it needs an applicant to start work immediately, whether the work site is a physical presence or others, and that individual has tested positive for the virus that causes COVID-19, or has symptoms or been exposed. So that's where they kind of punt a little bit, and they don't look at it from a hiring standpoint. They can go back to it from a health standpoint and look at it, okay, are they 5 days? Can they come in with a mask? That's typically where the CDC, whenever they pick back, they're going to look at those kind of scenarios. And you always will want to go look back at our previous guidance that we've done for your industry, because a lot of the emergency temporary standards, CDC guidance have become industry specific, rather sector specific. So you're not going to want to look at, make sure you're not looking at the healthcare one, because that's very, very different than what you all need. There's another one that deals with withdrawing a job offer. May an employer postpone the start date or withdraw a job offer because of the employer's concern that the individual is highly susceptible, is one of those high risk category underlying medical condition that puts them at risk of increased attracting COVID-19. They're not. So underlying conditions, increased risk, you're as an employer saying, I just don't want to deal with them being out for 10 to 14 days. If they get really sick or out for a month, no, you may not discriminate in that area as well. A couple others here quickly, and then we'll jump into the other regulatory areas. EEOC here on K5 asking about an employer may require an employee to comply with the vaccination requirement applicable to all employees entering the workplace if they have sought an exemption based on disability. So the employer may require an individual with a disability to meet a qualification standard applied to all employees, such as safety-related standards requiring COVID-19 vaccination, if that standard is job-related and consistent with the business necessity that apply to that employee. Again, this is one area that I don't probably see many of our members doing the requirements here in some areas at this stage, at least not moving forward, but this is also an area for our members to be aware of. And to our friends out on the left coast, that's always left out, California. They have a new ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard, they put out, I believe, on June 18th. And this is a proposed rule that's going to, they're calling it a permanent standard. What that means is they don't intend on issuing additional temporary emergency standards before 2020, end of 2024. So this one actually does a couple of good things. There's 5 changes that this California COVID rule made. We only included 4 because the other one wasn't relevant to you all. So if you read that in the papers, that's why it is. Also, we focus on California because many other states across the country take their cues from there. And what they've done is change the definition with regards to close contact, 15 minutes of continuous contact over 24 hours, more time to notify close contact. They've put language in there that now says as soon as possible. So an employer would have to notify their other employees or contractors, whomever, that they might have been in close contact. Well, the language right now in the statute in California law says you must do it within 24 hours. Now that's going to maybe potentially conflict. So the way that you look at it is the new ETS that comes out will start on January 1, and that will be your as soon as possible. But lastly, we do want to point out that record keeping, to keep the confidential, keep the records for 2 years, and it no longer requires you to do exclusion pay, which for those of you that are out in California, that's going to be important for those that are excluded from the workplace for the COVID reason. So take a look at that, but let's get off COVID a little bit and bring it a little closer to home. Now, John, if you want to set it up, and then maybe we'll turn it over to the Bracewell folks to get a little bit more in the weeds here on the impact of the Supreme Court decision. But John, we did have a decision recently.
Yeah, for those of you who want to know what a Supreme Court decision looks like, this first screenshot is what the Supreme Court issues when they issue a decision, and their final decision of this term was a whopper. It was where they basically said that the EPA does not have the authority to to regulate carbon emissions emitted from power plants. And so this was a big decision. It probably wasn't the biggest decision that this Supreme Court issued in this term, because they had many different issues out there. But Paul and Caitlin, this has been an earth-shattering regulation to some extent, but to other extent, I mean, I think you're still going to see the EPA, continuing their authority of regulating industry.
Yeah, the court said that EPA can't mandate quote generation shifting to reduce CO2 emissions from the power sector, but it didn't provide much guidance about what EPA can do. So it's not. So basically, this case means that under Obama, they attempted to use the Clean Power Plan to reduce emissions from the power sector. To reduce the impact of climate change. The court said you can't do that, even though the Biden administration had talked about reinstituting that attempt because it was ended by the Trump administration, but it hadn't done so yet. So basically, the court ruled on a proposed rule that wasn't proposed at that time. However, it clearly shows that if Congress did not specifically write something into the Clean Air Act, that the EPA can't just interpret it and expand on it. However, the EPA has a lot of tools in its toolbox. As I think I've mentioned before, we've seen an unprecedented active EPA regarding some of our clients, ranging from chemical companies to manufacturers. So it's not like the ruling has said the EPA can't do anything to affect climate change. It's just they can't use the Clean Air Act to do so. So be prepared. There will still be a lot of action by the EPA and by the Biden administration. This is a top priority of them, but it is a significant decision in that it made it more difficult for them to do things.
But the key point, Paul, is that what the Supreme Court said was Congress did not grant the EPA authority to regulate under the Clean Air Act with what they're doing. Do you really think Congress is going to, either this Congress or any future Congress in the near future, is going to grant the EPA that authority? I'm not so sure.
No, I mean, the Supreme Court said that EPA and other agencies need explicit authorization to proceed in addressing major questions that have profound effects on the economy. I don't think Congress is going to go back and amend the Clean Air Act next session to give them that authority. But as I said, there are many other tools in the toolbox for them to use their enforcement mechanisms to, try to achieve President Biden's goals regarding climate.
Right, yeah, so what you'll expect now from the regulated community is going to be increased use and expansion of existing standards and rules. So you'll see a tightening of those that they already have for a number of years, have the authority, because they do have the authority under Massachusetts v. EPA to be able to move forward with those emissions. But there's also going to be other regulations. I mean, John, what do you think about OSHA, SEC? Is Congress going to say we didn't give you that authority, or in the court?
I do think there'll be. This decision will lead to more litigation. I think is what we're going to is a very conservative interpretation of this decision says that this decision will have widespread impact on many different agencies like the National Labor Relations Board, like OSHA, like the EEOC. And so it's going to be interesting to see moving forward is how limited this administration and any future administration is going to interpret this Supreme Court decision.
Yep, and so John, I think a couple other things here as we keep going through it. I do think that there's going to be over time a really big impact with regards to the regulatory changes. I think you've got, like you said, the SEC, OSHA. We were at OSHA yesterday, and they're starting to think about how they can go about and moving through their processes. And even up on Capitol Hill, we're starting to see some movement from Democrats as we get closer to the election with regards to what they need to be doing. And on union language that they're trying to put in the National Defense Authorization Act. I think we were successful in getting the union language kicked out of the China bill that we'll talk about in a minute here. But there's a lot of activity going on with the regulatory space that we expect to see. in the coming weeks, in the coming months, especially as the court impact is going to change a lot of things here.
And this is very troubling. I mean, the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, is typically passed every year. In the end, it's towards one of the last bills moving out of the Congress, but it generally passes with in a bipartisan way. And this year we saw, and this is why it's so important that we as one voice participate with a coalition. So our coalition partner, the Committee for a Democratic Workplace, appealed to the leaders of the Congress to say, hey, don't include language in the National Defense Authorization. Don't include language that would eliminate the unions, that would eliminate the secret ballot in union representation elections. And so, because we participate with our coalition partners, we were successful in getting that knocked out.
Yeah, and there's a couple other things. Next week, there's going to be a markup in committee with regards to the heat index rule, and Congress is going to try to mandate that OSHA move forward with the heat index. We were at OSHA yesterday meeting with the administrator, himself and his team, and they're not close on that standard. They're going to get through a SABREFA panel on small business impact, and they're going to do some other reviews, but I think they're going to end up with early next year. We'll get some more information as they work with us and the stakeholders in the coming months. Jumping back in here where we are on supply chains, as we want to transition over into the competition bill on China. That's really making a lot of headwinds and taking up a lot of our time up here in Washington. But this is just want to give you an idea of the reason we threw this in here. This is the Federal Reserve. They put together the Beige Book, something we watch closely. If you all should take a look at it, we've got members that have spoken to the Fed and answered their questions on how the economy looks. And are things declining? Are shortages declining? And what this means is frequency of referrals, so shortages are starting to see decline. And so that we take as a positive sign from that standpoint, and the additional expiration of onshoring and reshoring and supply chain shifting getting additional attention during corporate presentations. What this means is when there's a corporate earnings call, they record and there's a transcript, and you can go through how many times they talk about COVID, how many times they talk about shipping and transportation. And here's what they're talking about. They're increasing the amount of conversation that's happening about nearshoring and reshoring and onshoring. Look at the Q2 numbers in the far right there. That is a pretty good confidence boost for manufacturing. I know we're trying to will ourselves into a recession, and we might end up in a short one eventually, but this tells us that there's still expansion in manufacturing with 116% increase in new construction and plants. And then lastly on this, we just want to put out there are still supply chain disruptions. Our ports are getting better. There's no question, but we've been telling folks that there is an issue with regards to freight and that distribution on the rail lines, and those talks did not come to fruition by July 1st, as we told you it wouldn't. And so now the president stepped in and said, you need to come to an agreement. The presidential board is going to start mediating and then presenting options. Now this is a non-binding board, but they can present their options, recommendations to Congress, who can make it binding. But John, I think it's no secret in this town that Biden and AMLO, the president of Mexico, do not like each other. The president of Mexico does not like the United States. I actually saw a poll the other day that said almost 40% of Mexicans thought it would be better if China was the superpower of the world. So this is just another shot right here, John, between Mexico and U.S. over energy.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, the U.S. Signed the USMCA, the new NAFTA legislation, and that when a party has a disagreement with Canada or Mexico, there's a procedure for dispute settlement. And here we see the United States says that it believes that Mexico is subsidizing their energy industry, providing a disadvantage for U.S. energy companies to provide services into Mexico. And so, to Omar's point, the two presidents don't see eye to eye. I think the two Congresses don't see eye to eye. But this is one of the first, but it is very high profile dispute between Mexico and Canada. One of the first ones since the signing of the USMCA.
Okay, let's just get right into the China competition bill. We've been talking about the CHIPS Act. We started talking about Endless Frontiers Act when we were lobbying Todd Young when he was working on that in 2019, and we're moving forward. The Senate did begin with the procedural votes last week or this week rather, on July 19th, and that sets us up for a vote on it could be as early as Tuesday night, but most likely we're going to get a bill on the Senate floor for votes starting on Wednesday morning. And I think we've got the votes for it based on my conversations. I don't know, John, what you're hearing, but as of right now, they might, and I don't know if They might end up getting to 70. Well, that's my bold speculation, but it won't be anywhere lower than 63, 64, which is a very, very strong message to be sent over to the House of Representatives, where John Pelosi has come out in support of it.
Yeah, this has been a bill that's been has been a roller coaster all year long. This is a bill where you had Senator Young and Senator Schumer, who this has been a top priority for them. When the bill initially passed the Senate, it had a number of Republican votes. When it passed the Senate, I think there were 16 or 17 Republicans who voted for it. Then it moved over to the House. When the House passed it, many progressives thought that was the last vehicle leaving the station. So they threw in a lot of what some would call partisan political priorities in that legislation. And then there was a 108-person member conference committee to work out the differences. That, as Omar and I predicted weeks ago, when 108 people in Congress get together to negotiate something, nothing happens because everybody's trying to determine their own priorities. And so in the end, it was Schumer and the big four, Schumer, McConnell, Pelosi, have come together and says, let's do a CHIPS bill. Omar and I have had a number of meetings with folks in the Senate and Capitol Hill and committee staff. And when we were asking them, this is before the positive news that Omar talked about, that this bill was going to be moving, they were saying, when we would ask them what is going to happen by the end of the year, and they says chips, chips, chips. And it wasn't necessarily the full Senate USICA bill. It's certainly not the House passed bill. It's a slimmed down. People are calling it Chips Plus, Semiconductor Chips Plus. But Omar, there's a number of real positive things in this legislation that helps our NTMA and PMA members that we've been advocating.
Yeah, my emails with Schumer staff on Monday, they'd already told us what was going to be the foundation. It was going to be more than chips. They'd already identified the ORON, which is the wireless, and a couple other provisions that had already been agreed upon. What we got basically everything we wanted in this bill but one item, and I'll go into those in a second. So there was a lot going on last weekend and throughout the early part of this week to ultimately get us here. We'll spare you those details, but let's just jump in. Everyone makes the biggest point out of the CHIPS section. That is the semiconductor, the $52 billion to incentivize domestic semiconductor manufacturing. As you can see, here's how it breaks out in there. And as we go through the next few slides, I'd really like to emphasize how much there is here for workforce. And that is really was one of our top priorities that we continue to press to make sure that that stays in. So there's a lot in here for workforce development, R&D. They've got another $200 million to grow semiconductor workforce, advanced manufacturing investment credit. So I want to pause on this for a second. This did come out of the Build Back Better and also did come out of Senate Finance that was ultimately included in here. We've got that legislative language. We don't have this final CHIPS language. So we're just want a word of caution. We're trying to interpret this provision based on what we saw previously when we were working on it. There's two parts to this. Think of this as the semiconductor manufacturing and then semiconductor tooling equipment. And that's the language that they don't actually define semiconductor tooling equipment in either that language there, and there isn't a statutory definition when we were looking through this yesterday. So we're still going to need to see what they in fact had come up with on Tuesday when they get the language over the weekend. And we'll take a look. But there is also a 25% investment credit for investment in semiconductor manufacturing, and incentives for advanced manufacturing semiconductor tooling equipment is the language that's in there for property placed in service starting in January 1st of next year. So that's something that we want to flag out there that could potentially be beneficial for that segment of our members that are making this kind of tooling equipment potentially directly and specifically for the semiconductor industry. And the other thing that we got in here that we were fighting for, you don't see words like this in legislation that Congress passes. And I know it's the MEP and some have their concerns on it, but they're looking at an assessment of domestic capabilities for manufacturing here and trying to understand where are some of the holes, what are the hidden costs of relying offshore. Look at these words: forming, casting, machining, tooling, metal refining. These aren't things that you'd find in a standalone bill. This Congress is really getting into the downstream industries that we've been pressing them for. It's not just OEMs and hope for a trickle down. They really are getting into the weeds, John, and I think that's a reflection of them understanding you can't just snap your fingers and get a ventilator. You have to have a domestic supply chain that's able to get you there.
Yeah, and you know, Omar and I have been advocating to policymakers on Capitol Hill for years now, talking about, you know, it's not just the big boys, the small and medium-sized manufacturers is the lifeblood of our economy. And you know, with this legislation, it really does reflect that yes, they are looking, and that they understand the importance of the downstream industries.
Yeah, they do. You take a look at what else we got in this bill, and I'm going to talk about the manufacturing institutes here a little bit, and some of you will dust off your cobwebs that were involved in some of the early work on this back in 2012, 13, and 14. But look at all the, we do have some good funding that's coming in for this, for the National Science Foundation, looking at the Manufacturing USA Institutes, and I'm going to talk about that one, why that's so important. The Manufacturing USA Institutes, those used to be the NNMIs that were codified by the Revitalizing American Manufacturing Innovation Act of 2014. And that was, until this bill, the most significant and consequential bill for manufacturing of that decade, because it had a lot in there that created these public-private partnership innovation centers. There were 16 at the time. They've expanded since, and they've got them across the country where they put together the researchers at universities, they put together the companies themselves, the private sector businesses, the trade associations, and then the government, and they try to put it together. And look at the amount of additional work that they're doing here. NIST is going to get a big bump up, and combating supply chain disruptions. That's something that we were looking at. The National Supply Chain Database language did make it into this bill. We believe that this is basically going to be an advertisement for our members. You think of your directories that you've got online. We believe that this mapping will ultimately be able to assist that in identifying domestic capabilities that should be receiving that work, especially when it comes to government contracts. And the last one here, before I turn it over to John to transition us into some of the trade issues, will Grow Manufacturing USA. This is where we just discussed those manufacturing research institutes that I mentioned from the previous slides. They're proposing to create a new one with the focus on education and workforce development. We think that's very significant. To give you an idea of what the other ones do, they've got digital manufacturing, they've got semiconductors, they've got the oil industry's got theirs, they've got all kinds of exploratory. Their whole concept there is R&D and investment. And we're really excited if this one does go through. We're hoping that our group here in One Voice play a leading role in that partnership. But before we move, John, do you want to just kind of, what are your thoughts? I do believe we're going to pass the Senate with over 60. On the House side, I think we might lose 10 to 20 Democrats. I think we might get 15 to 25 or so Republicans. What are your thoughts on us getting, so we're going to pass the Senate next week? Do you think it goes through the House the week following?
I really do. I had several meetings this week with Republican members of Congress, and they were talking about the importance of just passing this CHIPS bill. And so, you know, provided it doesn't get too bogged down, and as you had correctly mentioned, the bill is still not finalized yet. I mean, the vote is going to probably be Tuesday, and they're still going to be tinkering with the bill between now and over the weekend. But I don't think, I mean, there's such a commitment from a bipartisan way in the Senate to not make this what they call a Christmas tree in Washington, where they add all kinds of extraneous materials under this legislation. And I do think it will pass. Speaker Pelosi has already indicated she's willing to support it. I agree with you. I think they're going to lose a couple of progressive Democrats on this bill, but I think you're going to get a number of House Republicans who are going to vote for that legislation.
Yeah. I mentioned the two things we did not get in there. So in all transparency, we were trying to get in trade adjustment assistance for firms and community colleges. We always knew it wasn't going to make it in because Republicans told us no way. So that is not in there. We've been working on that since last August. And then as of now, the College Transparency Act and Jobs Act on Pell Grants, that is still not in, but to John's point, we're still open and we're still trying to get that through. But as we're just getting to 12:29 Eastern here, we want to try to wrap this up the next 6 minutes. Just give you a quick sense here. We're going to talk about the China tariffs and China review, since we do have ongoing reviews in a couple of places. We thought this was an interesting statistic with regards to, y'all can look at this later, but the average monthly amount of 301 tariffs paid under this president is 3.8 billion, and that's 67% higher than the average paid during Trump's tenure. 55% of all Section 301 tariffs, however, have been paid under the previous administration, with the rest paid under that. Now, what that tells you is we're importing more. It's really, I look at it with the economic hat, 67%, that means, yeah, you're bringing in more product. And that's ultimately what's happening there. So that's another interesting note that we took care of. But John, there is the U.S. Trade Representative who's mandated to do a review, and they just closed out their first list review on July 5th.
Yeah, when President Trump put the tariffs in place, there was a 4-year review. The ITC is in the process of reviewing whether to keep these tariffs on or extend them even further. As Omar said, they first started with the list 1 review. They're continuing moving forward with the list 2 review. Consecutively, the International Trade Commission, at the request of Congress, is doing an investigation on whether to determine the economic impact of what the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs and the 301 have had on the economy. And for the past 2 days and continuing today, the ITC is having hearings, and we have had a number of One Voice members testify to indicate the concerns of to express their concerns about the 232 and urge the ITC to recommend lifting of the tariffs. But it's just, they're not going to necessarily make a specific recommendation. They're just going to relay to Congress that what impact that these 232 tariffs will have on the economy.
Yeah, so this slide's on 301. There's two different things going on. I know it can be confusing. The section 301 is under review in two places. The U.S. Trade Representative is the decision-making body, and that's the one that's reviewing whether or not to continue the current trade action in its entirety or not. The president was likely to make a decision last month and then last week, and they keep putting it off because it's politically perilous. John is referring here to the section 232 and the 301 investigation. I'd welcome Paul to jump in here too in a slide or so. This is ongoing right now. I've actually got it up on my other computer, and they've got a number of panels still going. They had 75 witnesses testifying on both the section 301 and or the section 232 steel tariffs. This is a non-binding report, non-binding. There's no recommendations to be included. Congress mandated that they do this report and report it back by March of 2023. But they're doing, this isn't a legal investigation like it normally would be, where they make a determination whether to continue or apply tariffs or duties. This is more of an economic investigation. So what they're looking for here, we've got to file a post-hearing brief, so we really could use anyone's help with regards to some additional data that they've been asking for. How have the section 232 steel or aluminum tariffs directly economically impacted your business from an economic standpoint? Can you point to specific loss of productivity, specific loss of revenue? Can you put a fine number on it? Are there certain metals from certain places? So those are the kinds of questions that they're looking at, is more purely from an economic impact on industry, and it doesn't lead to any recommendations. But Paul, I'd be interested in some of your takeaway and hear some of the statements that were put out by both NTMA and PMA members that testified, which was very helpful on Wednesday.
Yeah, I think our role, One Voice member role, is so important because yesterday was all steel producers, and it's really two different worlds about how the sky is going to fall if they take the tariffs off. And the tariffs didn't affect the inflation rate, and everybody gets plenty of steel. In fact, one of the commissioners said, well, I don't really understand, if you can't get the steel from your domestic sources, can't you just get it and pay the 25% tariff from somewhere else? So there's a lot of education going on that needs to go on. And we received during the Q&A, and again, both NTMA, Mark Vaughn, who is an NTMA member, Stuart Spire and Scott Buer, who's PMA members, and David Klotz, who was running off to a trip and was able to testify before he ran to the airport, which we really appreciate. It's so important to get information, and there is really specific information regarding production and inability to meet orders and things like that we need to provide as a follow-up that's due in August. And I think that without us, we wouldn't have been able to really correct the narrative. We did send out a press release with some quotes from members that testified, and some of those headlines below it are the results. So great job by everybody. And for those who answered the survey, which we submitted for the record, we had more than 70 members respond to the survey that showed no surprises about delays in delivery and about the impact of the tariffs. So thanks for everyone. We have a lot more work to do before the deadlines of I think it's August 21st to submit some post hearing briefs. So we'll be reaching out to you for some specific information. We greatly appreciate the support. And don't forget to listen to our podcast, Talking with One Voice, wherever you get your podcasts. We put them up every 2 weeks, and we talk about the issues that we discuss here, but it's in a much more conversational way. And so please take a listen.
Thanks, and as always, go ahead, John.
Yeah, and for those who like the content that we provide, whether it's through the webinar, whether it's through our Monday morning calls or the podcast that Paul just talked about, if you'd like this content to continue, we hope you would consider supporting both NTMA's GAF fund, which is they allow corporate contributions, or PMA's advocacy fund. We thank those many who have participated in this webinar have already contributed, and we thank you for contributing. But for those who haven't, we ask that you would consider digging deep and making that corporate contribution.
As always, please feel free to type in any questions in the box that John mentioned on the right as we get ready to wrap here around 12:35. Please, if you haven't already, shoot us a note if there's any questions that you might have offline. We've got a lot going on even in August coming up with a couple of things and some regulatory activity. We'll be keeping people posted. As of right now, we do have tentatively a webinar scheduled for Friday. I believe it is August 26th at noon Eastern. You should be getting a notice on that as well. That's a tentative hold, depending on what Congress ends up doing with the CHIPS Act, because we would like to, if it is finalized, go through that a little bit more detail for you all to see what opportunities may exist to improve the manufacturing environment domestically. Not seeing any questions. Enjoy the weekend. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you next month.